This video is sponsored by the Ides of March, a golden ticket Warhammer 40,000 event being held March 8th and 9th, 2025. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome back to the best armies in Warhammer 40k. This is the weekly video series where we break down large events from the past weekend and talk about the lists that are winning them. And today is for the weekend of February 15th and 16th, 2025, and this is a relatively exciting weekend. We had some new rules being used. We won't be talking about those in this video for reasons that I'll get to momentarily, but we will be discussing those later on in the channel, so don't go anywhere. We also had some huge wins. If you've read the title of the video, you'll probably know, from factions and detachments that we might not have expected to see at the podium level of these large GT events. So let's dive in and talk about a metagame breakdown. Now, we're presented with a very clear number one. This weekend, this was Adeptus and Custodes. They took down the Grand Tournament event at Warhammer World this weekend. That was Stephen Box from Vanguard Tactics going undefeated with a very cool shield host, which we'll be discussing in this video. Okeanos Rising was also an event that was dominated by Adeptus Custodes, with two undefeated Adeptus Custodes players, both using the pretty predominant at this point Solar Spearhead detachment at that event. Astra Militarum also did fairly well, taking down the Dark Sphere February as well as Forge Fire Winter Open. Now, I will throw a little bit of a caveat for these lists. We actually aren't going to talk about them this time around. We are staring down the barrel of the brand new Militarum Codex, and both of these events used the index rules for Astra Militarum, so these results are going to be outdated at the time this video is published, including a couple of now legended unit profiles being played. So we're going to go ahead and skip Astra Militarum for this week, but we'll certainly be talking about them quite a bit once the Codex rules enter the normal competitive circuit. Space Marines also did fairly well, with a little bit of an interesting throwback to some old varieties of lists. Space Wolves undefeated at the Down Under 40k February Dawnbringer GT, say that 5 times fast. Ultramarines also took down the Red Dragon 40k GT. Chaos Demons going undefeated at the Wyohammer February GT. Grey Knights podiumed at that Warhammer World Grand Tournament event. And we also saw Death Guard take down the Club Champs 2025. Now, the last one, and certainly not the least, is Imperial Agents, who were able to take down Warzone Wellington 2025, and that's what I'm really excited to talk about, because it's been a while since we've discussed Imperial Agents. It is very difficult to go undefeated with that army, and winning a GT with it is phenomenal, so I'm excited to break that video down. Now, I'm going to put Eldar on the list here as well. They were able to take down the Duke City Games as well as Brighton 40k GT, however, these were both much smaller events. I'm actually not going to talk about these in this video because both of those events were using the brand new rules from the very recently released Eldari Codex. I'm going to be talking about those as well as some other results that we're seeing from Eldar this weekend after the Codex was released later on this week. So stay tuned to the channel because I'm going to be making a bespoke video to talk about Eldar results specifically. Normally we don't dive into the smaller events on this channel. Anything sub 20 to 24 players I will usually leave out of my results, but I do want to talk about this brand new faction and these new list archetypes that we're going to be seeing coming into the meta. Now, if you want to watch any of this coverage from this weekend, unfortunately, it was slim pickings this week because none of the event coverage teams that I'm aware of were live this week. So I don't believe that any streams went down. But if you know of any Warhammer 40k live streams from any of these events that were live over the weekend, please go ahead and let me know down in the comment section because I couldn't find any. And with that, we're going to go ahead and move over to these lists right after a word from our sponsor.
The Ides of March are approaching, and you should beware of missing the Ides of March GT held by Treasure Trove Keep on March 8th through 9th, 2025. This is the second year that the Ides of March Grand Tournament will be running, and if you are just hearing about it for the first time ever, it is a 100-player GT held up in Rockport, Maine. The event is held at the Samoset Resort, an absolutely gorgeous location, taken from me as someone who was there last year. Oh my god, the location is incredible. incredible. You get wonderful views and beautiful weather while you're playing some Warhammer 40k. In addition to a 5-round Warhammer 40k GT, there is also a 100-player AOS event if you're more of a fantasy connoisseur. There is also the Ides of March Golden Brush painting competition that is judged by none other than Goobertown Hobbies. So if you don't want to be a goober yourself, you should head on over to treasuretrovekeep.com/Ides of March 2025 and go get yourself a ticket. I'll also be there at the event live streaming, so you can catch coverage of it here on the channel, but really I would rather see you on camera in person at the tournament. So get your tickets today and I'll see you there.
Now we're going to start by discussing the Grand Tournament at Warhammer Worlds. These Warhammer World events always just call themselves Grand Tournament, which I always think is kind of funny. It's a little on the nose. Couldn't come up with an interesting title for your event, but it is, I guess, indeed a Grand Tournament being played over at Warhammer World. Now, unfortunately for us, the placings for the event are actually unavailable, but these two, the number one, Table 1 and Table 2 placers, are undefeated for this week. And we're going to start by discussing Stephen Box and his Adeptus Custodes. For those who don't know, Stephen Box is from the Vanguard Tactics YouTube channel, an absolutely phenomenal informative YouTube channel, as well as a 40k coaching service, and he's been championing this pretty jet bike focused variety of Adeptus Custodes, I think since LVO, where we discussed it when we broke down lists from that event, and it's nice to see him see some success with it with this 5-0 result. This is using the Shield Host detachment, so that is the index detachment that gives the army enhanced critical hits, which is going to be huge with the relatively low model count but high efficiency units that we are including in the army. This includes a Blade Champion, as well as a pair of Dawn Eagle Jetbike Shield Captains. One of those is rocking Hurricane Bolters, as well as the Panoptis Specs enhancement to give his unit Ignore Cover. We then have a single unit of Custodian Guard, 2 units of Alaris Custodians, as well as 2 units of Venatari Custodians, 1 unit of 3 of those, and 1 unit of 6. So already we're sort of playing the reserves portion of the game quite a bit. These Alaris Custodians can jump in onto the table from Deep Strike. They can even uppy-downy themselves, and then we can potentially jump in Venatari Custodians after them. We can Rapid Ingress one of these units and then duplicate Rapid Ingress on the Venatari Custodians as well. So we have the opportunity to sort of redeploy or change the weight of this army onto one flank or the other incredibly quickly. Now these 6 Venatari Custodians are fascinating. One of them is including a Tarsus Buckler. So he has his Kinetic Destroyer, so his big sustained hits 2-shot strength 6 pistol weapon, which is not that exciting even when compared to the 2-shot 2-damage lance that they can alternatively take. However, it does increase his wounds characteristic to 4, and that allows the unit to sustain 1 additional hit from a 3 damage attack profile. Since the entire unit is 3 wounds, the inclusion of that Tarsus Buckler allows you to basically soak an additional 2 damage into the unit, where normally something like a Tyrannid Exocrine or a Plasma Destroyer from a Redemptor Dreadnought, one of these big 3 damage heavy weapons, is going to absolutely devastate this unit. This shield allows you to absorb 1 additional hit from that and actually maybe only lose 1 model from that activation, and that is a huge deal, especially if you are trying to aggressively play this unit. That's a cool little piece of technology there to make that unit more difficult to kill, although the other 3-man unit of Venatari Custodians are just playing the standard Venatari Lances. We then have 3 units of 2 Vertus Praetors. They are all rocking Hurricane Bolters, which gives them a huge volume of this twin-linked 2-damage shooting. As I mentioned before, alongside that Panoptis Specs, we can get to EP1 Ignore Cover and 2 damage, which makes them pretty good at knocking down kind of medium infantry. And we also have access to Archaeotech munitions in the Shield Host attachment, so we can give those weapons lethal or sustained hits, which allows them to further compound that high volume of attack into additional damage into a wide variety of targets. Now the Vertus Praetors are also going to be huge in this detachment in specific, because they do have a relatively low volume of attacks, but their attacks are incredibly powerful, high AP and lance as well, with those Interceptor Lances, which is awesome. And you're going to be able to improve that with their 5-up critical hits on, so we're going to be able to basically improve the attack volume of these Vertus Praetors by about 30% when we're skirmishing with the Vertus Praetors to clip through infantry or even to hit even harder targets. This army is also relatively MSU. We have a lot of these little 2-man units instead of focusing on the huge bricks. The only real brick that we're taking is the Venatari Custodians, although I guess this 1 unit of Custodian Guard with the Blade Champion might count as well. But that means that it has a lot of flexibility, and that's compounded as well with multi-potentiality, which allows you to fall back back, shoot, and charge. They can't trigger their mortal wound ability because that will only trigger on a normal move. However, they are still going to be able to skirmish with a lot of enemy armies, and even having just one shield captain or one Vertus Praetor alive out of these units is dangerous to especially most utility units of the game, and especially once we consider that we have that 6-shot, up to 6-shot, potentially a Hurricane Bolter profile in there as well. Last and certainly not least, we have a unit of Witch Seekers for some forward operation. Those ladies will scout in and perform some secondaries in the early game. And then we can't forget as well, on top of that, that we have the flexibility provided by those shield captains with their once per game ability to fall back after fighting. So this army is ridiculously mobile, has a ridiculous level of control over its movement between rapid ingressing, deep striking. These units, the infantry units, are on the table. Advance and charge once per game on the Custodian Guard, the incredible maneuverability from the Vertus Praetors, and then the ability to fall back, shoot, and charge with any of those units. It's very difficult to pin down this army. And you can tell that in the hands of a good player who is very good at operating the fight phase, like Stephen Block clearly is. Basically every army that he plays tends to be a fight phase oriented army. This army is absolutely terrifying. Super cool build from Stephen Block. It's cool to see something that isn't just the standard Solar Spearhead seeing some success. And yeah, I'm excited that this one was able to take down a GT. Now moving back to our top placings here, we also saw Kian Tan rocking Grey Knight. Now if you're familiar with the Tactical Tortoise Discord server, or you're familiar with the T5S2 tournament series that I run on Tabletop Simulator, you might recognize that name because this is Ash C, who is a T5S2 season champion. She's actually won my invitational. She's participated in most of my invitational events, and she has won it in the past. And she is an incredibly skilled player, and she was able to take down a 5-0 record with this event. She did get second place on tiebreakers here with Grey Knights. Now this was a Warp Bane task force, so the Purifier-focused detachment that we are used to seeing from this army, but it does have some interesting inclusions. This includes, first off, Brother Captain Stern. Now I always like to see this guy included because I think he's a really good utility piece, and he seems really worth the points. He's a relatively resilient, pretty hard-hitting character, but he also respawns himself once he's killed. So even if you take him down, he's still going to be able to retain control of his objective, and that basically gives him kind of a lone operative style effect on the game, because your opponent's often reticent to dedicate a lot of shooting to that guy to actually get rid of him. We then also saw a Brotherhood Tech Marine with a Radiant Champion, so that's the enhancement to give him mortal wounds on his melee weapons. We then have two Nemesis Grandmasters. One of them has the Paragon of Sanctity enhancement, so they can flip a unit into Hallowed Ground for the phase once per game. We then have a Strike Squad for some forward operation. These guys are pretty important to lock in your home objective, allow you to move your other more terrifying units off that objective. It can also potentially give you a little bit more control over the midboard of the table. If they're able to lock in an objective in the center of the table relatively early, they can make it much easier for you to achieve Hallowed Ground with this army, which is a huge deal. We then also have an Interceptor Squad. I've talked at length about the interesting combination that these units have with the Warpbane Task Force detachment abilities. Essentially, because the Interceptor Squad is able to move up to an objective, shoot, and then move off of it, they can actually play with the level of control of that objective during the shooting phase and actually switch it basically back and forth. So they can move up, for example, take an uncontested objective at the start of the shooting phase. That's when level of control gets recalculated, so the Grey Knight player then has control of that objective. Let's say that gives them domination over the center of the table, so they consider that Hallowed Ground. You then can move the Interceptor Squad off of that objective and back into safety without actually losing that Hallowed Ground, because you retain control of the objective until the end of the phase. This is also important because we have two Psy Cannon equipped Purgation Squads. These two squads are going to get indirect fire when targeting something that another Psyker can see, and that's important because we can use the Interceptor Squads to spot for them. So in a perfect world, we can move up the Interceptor Squad, give the army Hallowed Ground, target a single enemy, shoot both Purgation Squads at it, and do some pretty reasonable damage, because with rerolls from the Hallowed Ground mechanic, they actually get to be pretty decent at shooting, especially when clearing out enemy screens and setting up for your charges in the future. We can then shoot with the Interceptor Squad last and move them out of line of sight. We retain level of control until the end of that phase, and we fired with our Purgation Squads, but we can keep everything in our army out of line of sight, assuming you have a safe place to put the Interceptor Squad. Lastly, we have a Purifier Squad as an infantry unit here, just to act as a little bit of a Hallowed Ground aura, so we can give it to the Nemesis Dread Knights over the course of the game, or we can close Deep Strike with it and get wound rerolls and just act as a little bit of a counterpunch in the late game. We have a unit of Servitors that can hang out with the Tech Marine if we so desire, as well as 3 Nemesis Dread Knights and a Calidus Assassin. So we have a really cool combination of the Purgation Squad and the Interceptors here, but otherwise we're actually going to be leaving a lot of the Purifiers that we normally see in the lists using this detachment for the Nemesis Dread Knight build. So we're going to be playing much more of a skirmish-focused game plan, a little bit less aggressive than the mass purifiers that we typically see in Warpaint Task Force. We're going to try to peel out enemy screens early, then drop the Nemesis Dread Knights in at optimal positions from teleport assaults in the future to then get in and get some shooting attacks on units that can't really counter-attack pretty well, and then in the late game we're going to get in and get those guys Nemesis Demon Hammers in melee. Pretty interesting build, very finesse-oriented. Obviously the Nemesis Dread Knights are a bit of a blunt instrument, no pun intended, because they have Demon Hammers, but also you do have to play this Interceptor squad and the Purgation squads fairly well if you want to get use out of them, but clearly they are an effective combination. And so congratulations to Ash C for taking out this event with a 5-0 record. That's a huge result. Now with that, we're going to move over to some of the smaller events this weekend. The Red Dragon GT in Ottawa, Ontario. This one was taken down by Jeremy Atkinson, rocking Ultramarines. Jeremy was running a Gladius task force, and this looks to be kind of a build that we've seen Josh Roberts play most famously. This includes Captain in Gravis armor with Artificer armor. Super like this guy. Actually, kind of want to include him in a lot of my builds now that I've seen Josh Roberts get huge use out of him, but he's just such a good utility piece. He has a 2+ armor save, 5+ feel no pain, halves damage, and is relatively high toughness already, so he's difficult to kill. He has a boatload of melee attacks. This build is taking a Power Fist and a Relic Chainsword, so he has a total of, I believe that comes in with 8 attacks of various strength and APs, but that's good enough to kill sort of 5-man enemy utility units and then be very resilient on the crackback. You can also use like squad tactics and other stratagems, Arbor of Contempt, to make him difficult to kill, and basically use him as a little bit of a beat stick and a little bit of a independent operator all by himself to just wander around and take objectives and kill other utility stuff. We then have a lieutenant with combi weapon, Marnius Calgar, and Rabute Gilliman. We can combo the combi weapon with Gilliman to give him lone operative, kind of standard stuff. We have an Assault Intercessor squad as a utility unit, 2 Ballistus Dreadnoughts, a company hero unit for Marnius Calgar to hop into, 1 Gladiator Reaper to help sweep infantry, an Incursor squad for the hit bonus so we can buff up our Vindicators, an Infiltrator squad, and then 3 Vindicators as well. So we're not really breaking any new ground with this list. We've talked about lists very similar to this in the past, but obviously this is an incredibly flexible list and hugely powerful. Josh Roberts took it to an excellent finish at Las Vegas Open after his podium finish at the Nottingham Super Major, where he then took the Gladiator Reaper to help it solve the Horde matchups a little bit, and clearly that is effective. So Jeremy is playing a pretty effective army, although it is something that we have seen before. Now with that, we're going to move down to Australia, where we are going to discuss Space Wolves, Woody Woo, undefeated at the Down Under 40K February Dawnbringer GT, with a bit of a throwback army. This is a Wolf Jail Stormlands Task Force. It's been a little bit since we've seen this list. Do you have success? But obviously it didn't really go that far away. Has been nerfed several times, but it is still seeing play. This is, for those who don't know, Stormlands Task Force, which has all of those benefits for mounted units, but we typically focus it on Thunderwolf Cavalry, just ranks and ranks of both Wolfen and Thunderwolf Cavalry down your opponent's throat. And I do think that I think the nerf to Armor of Contempt that we saw relatively recently is actually going to be a big deal for this army, because it tends to be a lot of AP1, maybe AP2 weapons, and Stormlands Task Force doesn't really come with many ways to buff your AP value, and so sometimes the Space Wolf army could actually just kind of bounce off other Marine armies. High toughness, high save, that would then Armor of Contempt and absorb tons and tons of attacks from lots and lots of these Thunderwolf Cavalry units could actually be problematic for them. And then if you can counterpunch and wipe 2-ish Thunderwolf Cavalry units in one turn, then we're looking really, really good. And the fact that Armor of Contempt only lasts for a single activation now might actually be a big deal. So we could see Stormlands Task Force actually come back a little bit. Now, this includes Herald Deathwolf. This is the mounted character with the Mantle of the Troll King, so he himself hits pretty hard in melee. He's got his 3 Thunderwolf attacks, but he also has 6 2 damage AP2 attacks on top of that as well. He's relatively cheap, 85 points. It always blows my mind for this guy, because his base stats are huge, and he also has a once per phase damage blank, so if you shoot him and charge him, after failing a saving throw, turn the damage characteristic to 0, and then can potentially do it when you overwatch him and then also in his own fight phase too, so he can blank like 4 damage results per battle round in most instances, unless you have other ways to attack him, which is wild. This guy's super hard to kill, but importantly, he can also help supplement that low AP value with devastating wounds on the Thunderwolf attacks for his attached unit. We also then have Logan Grimnar on Stormrider, so he can attach into a Thunderwolf cavalry unit as well, and he can come in with that once per game feat ability where he will buff up the entire army with hit rerolls. We then have 3 Wolfguard battle leaders on Thunderwolves with Thunder Hammers, and a Wolf Lord with Fury of the Storm. Interestingly, we are not taking Hunter's Instincts, which is the enhancement that typically allows you to strategic reserve earlier in the game. So we're actually just kind of playing this straight up. We're just going to be running these guys right up the middle of the table and using their aggression, their blood surge moves, and the reactive move that you get from the detachment to keep them alive. You can also ride hard, ride fast with these units as well to give them -1 to be hit and wounded. So they are actually just boatloads of 4+ invulnerable saves with a lot of attack modifier stacked on top. So maybe you don't really need to play too cagey with them. You can kind of just run them down the center and hope for the best. We have a single Assault Intercessor squad as well as 2 Scout squads for utility, and then the Thunderwolf Cavalry looks like 1 big brick of 6 as well as 2 smaller units of just 3 apiece to attach all those characters into, then a bunch of Wolfen to kind of follow in. So we do have a big push of this big unit that we can sort of push up the table, force the opponent back because he can trigger a reactive move for shooting them. If you do any damage, they're going to be able to move potentially into melee with you. So you have to kind of be very cagey when you're engaging with them. You can make them super difficult to kill with the stratagems, and then you can create table space that you can then put all the other Thunderwolf Cavalry units into the target. And I guess the fact that we're only putting basically 4-ish models, because they're going to have 1 or 2 attached characters, so maybe 5 models in these little units, means it's much easier to keep them out of line of sight and then use full throttle for a 9-inch advance and go 19 inches around walls and things in order to actually get them into the fight. So we don't necessarily need the big units in it. Might actually be better for the survivability to have the smaller units because it's harder to get line of sight to them. And then after those guys will crash into you, we then have 25 Wolfen who are going to be able to follow up with them. They don't take objectives, but if the objectives have already been kind of swept off by the Thunderwolf Cavalry, all you need is just more bodies to get into your opponent's face, and then just deliver a bunch of Thunderhammer attacks. Last and certainly not least, we have a Calidus and a Calexis Assassin for utility. So the Calidus Assassin with the uppy downy is going to be able to mess with enemy stratagem usage in the fight phase, which is a big deal. The Calexis Assassin is interesting because he has his once per game Shadow in the Warp effect and can come in 6 inches away from enemy. So you can actually try to flip control of objectives in your opponent's side of the table if he needs to. He also acts as a pretty good utility unit because he's very difficult to screen out. Really interesting to see the Stormlance Thunderwolf build back in the metagame. It's been a little while since we've seen these guys do fairly well, but obviously they haven't gone too far, and the archetype is still pretty strong. Now with that, we're going to move over to Laramie, Wyoming in the United States and talk about Wyohammer. This was a 25-player event and was taken down by Frank Guerra, who was playing Chaos Demons. Now this was a Legion of Excess, so the Slanesh detachment that we've been talking about. Feels like ad nauseum at this point. More recently, since it was released during the Gratzmas drop and absolutely started to put up results almost immediately. This included the Mask of Slanesh, a Keeper of Secrets with Soul Glutton, so it can regenerate wounds after it kills models in the fight phase, and another Keeper of Secrets with False Majesty to give other demons, not monsters, +1 to wound in melee around it. We then have a third Keeper of Secrets, so we're all in on the Keeper of Secrets this time, with no enhancements whatsoever. 1 unit of Demonettes, 1 unit of Plague Bearers to screen out the back line and lock in objectives. 2 units of 5 Seekers, so we can play very aggressively with this army, and a lot of times what it wants to do is make it difficult for you to get lines of sight onto the Keepers as they're moving up the table or they're deep striking into the enemy deployment zone. We can use the Seekers to scout up to very aggressive positions and then use the Phantasmal Longing to go through walls to actually just force them down the opponent's throat and move block the enemy. They're also good, especially with rerolls from the detachment ability at killing a lot of sort of utility units, 5 model units and stuff like that will actually go down. Assuming they don't have good melee profiles themselves, the Seekers are not difficult to kill. They aren't the easiest thing ever. And so they can actually be pretty good at sweeping utility units and making blocking the either charges from the other big melee units or the deep strikes from the Keepers of Secrets from coming down very difficult. We then also have 3 units of 6 Fiends. These guys will project the -1 to hit aura in melee for most enemy units, and with devastating wound attacks just have very, very
pretty good synergy with the detachment ability. Pretty standard stuff from these guys. They're also then going to benefit from the auras from the Keepers of Secrets. They all provide a +1 AP buff, and they can also provide that the +1 to wound from False Majesty. So they can follow up all of those Seekers with just endless amounts of really, really powerful melee units. Not super surprising we see a list like this do well. We've seen it do fairly well in the past several different events. These 18 Fiend builds are pretty common, and while the focus on Seekers in this list is pretty interesting, it definitely still seems very effective. We also have the Demonate unit as well, so we can use a little Thief of Pain to keep the Fiend units alive, so even if you can come back in with really powerful attacks, they basically have 10 floating wounds that you're going to have to get through if that Demonate unit is within range, which can change the combat math quite a bit and actually make it so that Fiend units can absorb an attack either from a charging unit, a fight first unit, or by using their seductive gambit to fight last even after they charge. You can then absorb the attack, not lose that much, and then the Fiends come back and absolutely destroy you, especially in combination with the Mask of Slash, so we can give enemies -1 to wound. You can make a Fiend unit, which is already relatively high toughness, -1 to be hit and wounded, and then pass the damage to the Demonettes, and that's very difficult for all but the most ardent melee units to actually take down, and then those guys are going to come back with full rerolls and eviscerate you. So pretty classic combinations from this detachment, but obviously incredibly effective, and especially if you don't have the mass, I think you just need basically enough profiles that sweep both the Keepers of Secrets and the Fiends. With shooting attacks, you also have to be able to get through the Seekers in order to get those attacks on target. Once you do that, the army is not very difficult to kill at range, but you have to get to that point, and that's the difficult position. Now with that, we're going to move all the way back to Canada. Kingston, Ontario saw the Club Champs 2025, a 29-player event, and this one was taken down by Kevin Rutherford playing Death Guard, but not any Death Guard, Flyblown Host. Now, we haven't really gotten to talk about Flyblown Host on this series because it kind of released with a little bit of a whimper. Not many players were picking it up, but clearly, Kevin Rutherford seeing some success with this build, and I'm really excited to talk about what he has included. So let's discuss this list. Now, for those who don't know, this is the Groundsmith detachment that focuses on infantry and making your infantry really difficult to kill. It gives them stealth, it gives them a 5-inch scout move, so especially if you're going first, you can really force a bunch of models down your opponent's throat. Now, you give up objective security, you give up your Contagions of Nurgle beyond just the -1 to toughness that the army rule has built in from the Plague Company detachment, but you do get some ways to improve the resilience of your units. So first of all, we have Typhus in the unit. We also have a Biologus Putrefier, so he gets his free grenade, as well as improves we have a Sorcerer in Terminator armor with Insectile Murmuration, so his entire unit, even if he's not attached to a unit, he grants some wound rerolls of 1 targeting enemies within contagion range. That affects all attacks, so it is going to affect your melee attacks automatically, because you're always going to be in contagion once you're being melee attacked by these guys, but it also will affect their ranged attacks. So regardless of what we attach him into, it's going to be pretty effective. Most of the time, we can find ways to attach these guys to get your target into contagion, but it looks like we're attaching to Death Shroud Terminators in this build, so he's going to be able to grant that wound reroll on that anti-infantry weapon, which is so good at knocking down enemies in Overwatch, at killing enemy screens, and then getting into the meaty targets behind them. We have another Sorcerer in Terminator armor with Droning Chorus. That gives his units ranged weapons assault, kind of a nice, maybe a filler ability. I don't know if this is seeing a ton of play here, because unfortunately these models can't advance in charge, but it does allow them to kind of get interesting angles on enemies and then clear enemy utility units, because he is likely also going to be going into another big Death Shroud Terminator unit, so he can maybe advance these guys into a relevant position, kind of threaten control of an objective, and then also kill a 10-man light infantry squad on that objective at the same time. And last but certainly not least, we have a Tallyman with Rejuvenating Swarm. That allows him to regain all of his lost wounds at the end of each phase. The Tallyman himself isn't the hardest thing to kill. He does benefit from the detachment ability, so he is stealth and he's base toughness 5, but he only has 4 wounds. So this is, again, largely I think a points filler inclusion. However, oftentimes the Tallyman just sort of chills on the back of the table. We could maybe dual attach it with the Biologus Putrefier, but I'm not sure we're doing that in this build. But we can just make him kind of difficult to kill. A lot of indirect fire can put wounds on this profile behind line of sight. It has a little little bit of a difficult time actually killing him. -1 to be wounded, equivalent to plus save, essentially, because of cover. If you're firing indirectly at him, and the requirement that you do all 4 wounds at once, because if you don't kill him in one phase, he's going to regenerate and he's going to go back to full. That means that a lot of players won't even try to attack him, because there's a chance that they just get no value out of their indirect fire at all. And that makes him much more difficult to engage with at the back of the table. He also then has this 50-50 chance to gain command points at the start of your command phase, so he can just generate value and hold down your backline objectives for the entire game if he wants to. So what are we attaching these characters into? We have a ton of characters sitting here. We have a 10-model Plague Marine squad, as well as 20 Death Guard cultists. Now, these guys all are going to be gaining that stealth and scout effect, so they're all going to be, I don't want to say fast, but relatively fast, and we can push them super far up the table. We then have 3 units of 6 Death Shroud Terminators. These guys are going to get their bodyguard effect when they are attached with a character. So when being shot at, they can be -1 to be hit, -1 to be wounded from their bodyguard effect and the combination with the detachment ability. And then once you get into melee, the unit with Typhus is a -1 to be hit as well in melee, and the units with the Terminator Sorcerers can be -1 damage on top of that. So these guys are super difficult to kill. So we have 2 units of Myphitic Blight Haulers. These guys can unlock the Myphitic Invigoration stratagem, which can make them -1 to be wounded. That is not only good for the Death Shroud Terminators if you have wound bonuses to try to get around their wound penalty that they have built in, but it can also be used on the lighter units. So we have 60 Poxwalkers in this army, so tons and tons of these, I don't want to say tough, but they're toughness 4 light infantry with a feel no pain. They're not the easiest thing to infantry sweep around, and you can make them -1 to be wounded, and they have stealth, so they're also -1 to be hit. So a lot of really high volume infantry sweeping attacks that don't have rerolls built in are going to be wounding them on 4s or 5s and then fighting into their feel no pain. So they are going to absorb just a ridiculous amount of damage and open up so much table space for your Death Shroud Terminators to jump in, teleport in, advance up the table, and start to actually get real work done. This just requires that your Mephitic Blight Hauler is within 6 inches of your infantry unit when you're targeted, which means you can actually string the Poxwalkers back pretty effectively too. So with 20 Poxwalkers, you have a lot of table space you can take up, and you can actually keep the Blight Haulers in a pretty defensive position, and then use the stratagem on the Poxwalkers, even though the Blight Hauler is pretty far away from the actual fight, so we can keep it locked up. We then have 2 units of Nurglings. These guys are incredibly important because they are going to be able to prevent enemies, potentially, if you win the deployment roll-off, from blocking your scout moves from happening. So I think what we want to be doing with this army is presenting our opponent probably 20 Poxwalkers to begin with, set up a situation where we're in stealth, we can get our -1 to be wounded from the Myphitic Blight Hauler, we can deploy our Nurglings in front of them so that your opponent can't jump in their own scouts to prevent your scout move from happening, scout them up the table, advance them onto objectives, and then basically layer all these defensive buffs and try to keep them alive for as long as possible. And if you're trying to get through, first of all, the Nurglings, if you're going first, can potentially movement block, or even if they just survive the first round, and it is not the easiest thing to kill 6 Nurglings. They have a 6-up invulnerable save, and they have 24 wounds with 6 of them in the unit, so getting rid of all of them in one go is kind of difficult. They can movement block your own stuff if they advance up and deploy aggressively enough, or they can prevent your chargers from getting into the Poxwalkers. So you're going to be fighting through this -1 to hit and -1 to wound on 20 bottles with a feel no pain. If you don't kill them, they're going to hold the objectives down and just sort of generate that value. And then even if you do kill them, you're in a position to get counterpunched by Death Shroud Terminators. So it's kind of a catch-22. You have to try to shoot these units off the table to keep the Death Shroud Terminators at arm's length, and that's super difficult to do because, again, they have so many defensive buffs against shooting. We then have a unit of Plague Bearers in here as well, I think largely to just hold down the back line. These guys are also pretty good deep strikers if we are just using our Tallyman to hold our back objective and don't feel like we need them to do that. Using them to rapid ingress into interesting positions. You can rapid ingress onto an objective, obsec that objective on your turn, and then even charge off of it. So there's interesting stuff you can do with Plague Bearers in an army like this that's so focused on board control, but in a pinch they can also just obsec your backline and screen your backline to prevent enemies from coming in and trying to mess with the Death Shroud Terminators before they deal with your 60 Poxwalkers. This army is absolutely sick. I love these Flyblown host builds. They're interesting to talk about in any case. it seems like it's very difficult to deal with as well. There's not a lot of like heavy armored vehicles, but the Death Shroud Terminators basically function in that capacity because they have a 2+ save, good invulnerable save, toughness 6, high toughness value, and are -1 to be wounded. So they oftentimes are the equivalent of like toughness 10 or so in a lot of situations, because a lot of things are wounding them on 4s that would normally be wounding similar heavy infantry on 3s. And so they kind of fill the role of these pretty ponderous heavy vehicles. So you have to have the capacity to kill 18 Death Shroud Terminators, 48 wounds worth of Death Shroud Terminators plus their attached characters, but also have the ability to sweep through 60 Poxwalkers that could also be -1 to be wounded. And most armies don't have that. So this is a stat check of the highest proportion, where a lot of armies aren't well-rounded enough to be able to deal with this stuff before it just pushes you out on primary entirely. Super duper cool build. Absolutely sick to see Flyblown host seeing some success. So huge congratulations to Kevin Rutherford for taking on the event. Now with that, we're going to move down to New Zealand and talk about the Warzone Wellington 2025, which was taken down by Courtney Thompson running Imperial Agents. I'm so excited to talk about this because it is a hell of a thing to win an event with Imperial Agents, and it's impressive every time it happens. Now, we are playing Imperialis Fleet, so the Navis-focused detachment. That's not too surprising, because oftentimes we'll see Imperialis Fleet be the choice for actual competitive play with Agents of the Imperium. Now, for those who don't know, this is the detachment that allows you to select either an enemy unit on the battlefield or an objective marker on the battlefield. If you select an enemy unit, your units get +1 to hit against them. It's kind of an Oath of Moment style thing. If you select an objective, you get +1 leadership, +1 objective control, and a 5+ invulnerable save when holding it. So oftentimes what we're going to be doing is trying to lock down objectives with this ability. It applies in your command phase, so you can use it prior to the end of your command phase when you recalculate control of those objectives. So you can buff your own OC on these objectives, and oftentimes these lists just play enormous numbers of units and just try to play the chicanery that Imperial Agents can bring out to try to steal objective control away from enemies. Now we're running a Calexis Assassin and an Eversor Assassin, as well as a trio of Inquisitors, 2 standard Inquisitors, one of them with Clandestine Operation. This allows you to place up to 3 infantry units from your army into infiltration, so we can take these units that have excellent control of our objectives and basically start them on the objectives. We can also play kind of a bit of forward operation control. Because we have a Rogue Trader in the army, we can also redeploy battle line units, so as long as we are using battle line on Clandestine Operation, we can then redeploy them after all the infiltrators have been placed down. So if, for example, you win the deployment roll-off, you can string entire units of 10 Agents infantry into the center of the table. Then, before you go to the roll-off to go first, you can redeploy them back into a safe position and prevent any enemies from deploying in that area. So you can control where enemy infiltrators can go, so they can't engage you on those objectives, and you can just farm points on them. We also then, as I mentioned before, have that Rogue Trader entourage, as well as a Watchmaster with digital weapons. That digital weapons will give him kind of a little mini grenade each time he fights. He has 3 dice and on a 4+ deals mortal wounds with them. And because he's kind of the melee beat stick in the army, oftentimes we'll see Deathwatch kill teams as a melee counterpunch in these builds. He can just generate a little bit of additional value out of that. Now with that, we are running a Deathwatch kill team. That's a max kill team there, 2 frag cannons, 2 Infernus heavy bolters, as well as 4 Deathwatch Thunderhammers, their big 3 damage Thunderhammer. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 units of Navy Breachers. So that's a lot of where our Clandestine Operation is going to be working. We're going to be able to deploy those guys up in the front and redeploy them around with the Rogue Trader Entourage, which we can also redeploy models into Strategic Reserve. So if we wanted to, we could even play more Strategic Reserves than are normally allowed. Normally it's up to 25% of your army, but if you do that outside of the battle formation step, so during the redeployment step, you can actually put D3 of them back into Strategic Reserve as well if we want to. So these guys will have a lot of maneuverability, either infiltrating or Strategic Reserving in. They also get wound rerolls on enemies on objectives, so they're good at sweeping away light enemy stuff. They can maybe do a little bit of damage. They have their grenade effect that can go out 18 inches, which is cute. They have a melt-a-gun with wound rerolls as well. We also then have 3 Imperial Rhinos. These guys are going to be transporting probably a combination of the Deathwatch veterans. Those guys are very often in Rhinos, getting the Rhino into kind of a staging point in the middle of the table, using its extra movement to set up in a position behind a ruin in the center of the table, and then disembark, advance, and charge the Deathwatch veteran unit out of it is a really big deal. But we also can place the other infantry units inside it. We can put things like the Navy Breachers if we are going to be pushing them up the table and trying to get value value out of their shooting to fight over objectives. We also have a set of subductors. These guys are pretty good at infiltrating as well because they can fight on death. So even if your opponent comes in, they're out of line of sight, you go in with really fast melee stuff, jump pack assault intercessors and things, for example, to try to weed them out. You can actually gain value from those units regardless. We can also just use the rhinos to deliver them as well. We then, interestingly, if we want to do some actual anti-tank, we have 2 Sister of Battle Immolators. These are going to be able to strip cover from enemies. That's a big deal because we can use their twin multi-meltas to shoot at hard targets, then fire their heavy bolter at a different target, for example, an infantry unit, strip cover from the infantry unit, then use the Navy Breachers with all of their infantry sweeping attacks with wound rerolls on objectives to clear that unit out with the essentially +1 AP you get from ignoring cover. Now, those have to take Sisters of Battle inside them, so we do have a Sister of Battle squad that's going to be able to combat squad into 2 separate units. So we do also have a Melta-Gun and Multi-Melta team inside one of those as well. So the Immolators are also going to be getting additional value from that because they're going to transport these ladies around the table. We can, even if in a pinch, we can drop one of them off right off the bat and then use the transport as an independent unit and just use the other squad as a utility unit. We just have to start them in the transport for that to be legal, unless we have any other Order Heretica stuff, which I don't think we do. But as soon as they're disembarked, that's A-okay. It's another benefit of having all of the transports in here as well. The rhinos, even if they're just being used to deliver these infantry units once per game, you're also then going to have an additional unit that can move block, that can get +1 OC on objectives, that can move around and perform actions. So real kind of like multiple small units, sort of horde mode energy here, because we're running so many of these 10-man units and so many transports for them. We then have the 3 subductor squads that I mentioned before. These guys just have like mass strength 4 EP1 melee attacks. Again, they fight on death on a 4+, which is nice, and they have a 4+ invulnerable save, so they're difficult to kill, and you can use them to sort of hold down objectives and gain value even if your opponent comes to take them. We then have last and maybe least a unit of Voidsmen at arms. So while these armies are relatively low on damage output, we can sort of combo together some pretty powerful attacks. We can use, for example, the Deathwatch kill team with Violent Acquisition. We can, as long as the target of our attack is on an objective marker, we can use the detachment ability to give them +1 to hit. That's regardless of the objective marker, but the rest of the effects will require it. But you can also give them Sustained Hits 1 and Lance in the fight phase, which will give the big Deathwatch Thunderhammer attacks ridiculous value. They should convert close to 100% of their attacks if they're +1 to hit and sustained hits. That's essentially hitting on 2s, so you're getting something like 10 3 damage, strength 10 Lance devastating hits through, which will pretty much kill most things in the game. That is a 2 CP stratagem and your detachment ability, but the combination of those effects are going to be hugely powerful. We can also sort of combo together things like that. The Immolators stripping cover from enemies, close quarters barrage on your Navy Breachers for +1 strength and AP. So we're good at basically once per game, we can knock down a heavy target with all those Thunderhammers. You can skirmish the other big stuff with the Sisters units. We have the Twin-Linked Multi-Meltas on the Immolators. We have Hunter-Killer Missiles on the Rhinos. So we're trying to find ways to get damage into heavily armored targets in as many ways as we can in Imperial Agents, but otherwise you are excellent at sweeping enemy infantry, so you can kill your opponent's high OC stuff. Then towards the late game, start selecting objectives with your detachment ability to give yourself +1 OC on, and these huge 10-man units of 4+ invulnerable save subductors, the Sisters of Battle, the Marines in the Deathwatch veteran unit are all excellent at grabbing hold and taking those objectives, and we also have ways to get units into, for example, our opponent's deployment zone with strategic reserves, so you can continuously score secondaries and then hold down the primary towards the end of the game and just kind of grit your teeth and hold on for as long as you can. And if you can do that, you can win just based on the fact you have a huge high volume of these kind of irregular Imperial units that can retain control of that and win you the game on primary. Super cool to see this detachment win. It's always really cool to see a really good player using this detachment because it's really weird and plays very differently than most other detachments that you've seen in the past. I guess we also have Kyria Draxus as well, who benefits from those attaching into those Navy Breacher teams. Her attacks getting wound rerolls from those guys is actually pretty big too, and ignoring cover and +1 AP and stuff is also huge for her. So there's a little bit of damage out of some of these units. We can kind of combo them together for some damage, but otherwise we're mostly focusing on the objective control proportion of the army in order to win. And that takes a lot of skill. That takes a little bit of a white knuckle tenacity to get through towards the end of the game, but obviously it is really cool to see every time it is successful. So huge congratulations to Courtney Thompson for taking down the event. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. If you want to support me, you can do so either over on Patreon, at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, or by joining as a YouTube channel member or a Twitch subscriber. I have been a little bit light on Twitch this past week, but that's because I'm moving my studio, and I don't yet have it all set up, so it's a little ugly right now, but hopefully next week we will be back to our normally scheduled Twitch streams. But otherwise, please go check out Ides of March. Thanks to them for sponsoring the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.